Hey guys, tonight we are going to be continuing our series called Understanding Faith. Last week, we learned what we had to have faith in, what this plan of God was from the very beginning. That God took on flesh in Jesus Christ and that he died as a man, even though he was perfect and totally sinless. And he did that in order to save humanity from what we called the devil's death, from hell. And he was resurrected 3 days later to prove that he accomplished this on our behalf. Well, tonight we're going to be continuing this series and specifically looking at the nature of faith as it is explained to us in Hebrews chapter 11. Now, I think that there are three main takeaways from Hebrews chapter 11, but before we get into those, I want you guys to take some time to read that chapter on your own and answer a few questions. So I hope you guys enjoyed reading Hebrews chapter 11. This chapter is what many popular commentators refer to as the Hall of Faith, because there are so many people from the Old Testament that are mentioned. But for our first point tonight, I want to look specifically at verse 1. Verse 1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." And so what can we take away from this verse? This is our most succinct definition of faith that is given in the Bible. Well, I think that the first point that we can take away is that faith is dependent on the promise maker. Faith is dependent on the promise maker. See, this verse says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Now, I want you to think about that phrase. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So we might ask the question, well, how can we be assured of something that we hope for? How can we be convicted of something if we haven't seen it? So I'm going to give you an analogy that I'll be referencing throughout the lesson tonight that I hope will be helpful to you. So imagine that you are told that $1 million has been transferred to your bank account. You're rich now. However, you can't actually check your account. My question is then, how would you live? If you can't check your account, if you can't see the money, but you've been told that it's there, how would you actually live? Well, I think the answer to this question depends on one thing. Who is the one telling you the information? If I walked up to you and told you that I put this money in your bank account, would you believe me? I hope you wouldn't believe me. But if Bill Gates walked up to you and told it to you, you'd probably be more inclined to believe him. And I would say rightly so. Why is that? Well, I think it's because what you have faith in matters. Who is guaranteeing this promise to you matters. Even though what you have faith in may seem crazy, like the fact that $1 million was added to your bank account, that's not actually what makes your faith crazy. Who you have faith in is what truly matters. You would be crazy to believe that $1 million was added to your bank account if I told that to you. But you would be far less crazy if Bill Gates himself told it to you. Now, I know that this may raise a few questions, so before we go on, I want you to take a break and answer a few questions with your groups. So our second point for tonight is that you cannot please God without faith. You cannot please God without faith. Look at Hebrews 11, verse 6. It says, "And without faith it is impossible to please him," being God. "For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him." See, as I mentioned in the last section, to other people, your faith may appear foolish. It affects both your understanding and your actions. Your faith impacts both your understanding and your actions. You can see that in verses 3 and 4, right? Verse 3 says, "By faith we understand," so on and so forth. Verse 4, "By faith Abel offered," that's an action. So it affects both our understanding and our actions, and those things may seem foolish to people sometimes. However, faith only appears foolish to others if they do not know the one who is assuring the faith. See, if people do not know who Bill Gates is, or if they don't think that you have a real relationship with him, then they will think that you are a fool for believing that he gave you $1 million. However, you know Bill Gates, and therefore you know that you are not a fool. This brings us to the point that you must know the assurer of your faith. See, the more you know him, the stronger your faith will be in his promises. And if you know someone, then you also know what pleases them. This is how the author of Hebrews is reasoning here in the beginning of chapter 11. If people don't have faith, they clearly don't really know God. And if they don't know God, they can't possibly do what he wants. It's hard to make a stranger happy, isn't it? It would be like a guy taking a girl to a country music concert, but then finding out that she doesn't actually like country music. See, you can't really please her in that way because you don't really know her. The author in Hebrews is writing to a bunch of Hebrews, to a bunch of Jewish people who were relying on their Jewishness, their own righteousness, in order to please God. But he's saying that they don't really know God. They aren't actually pleasing God with that. They don't have true faith because they don't know him. If they knew him, they would have faith in him. And they would believe his greater promises. They wouldn't think that they could just achieve these things, that they could receive this inheritance by working for it. But they would take God at his word and that he promised it to them. Now, this brings us to our third point for tonight, and that is that faith does not substitute the ultimate for the temporal. Faith does not substitute the ultimate for the temporal. So let me explain what I mean. We get this from Hebrews 11, verse 13. It says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. See, if you really believe in the promised treasure that is ours, you are not going to settle for the temporary comforts and pleasures of this world. If you believe that God has an inheritance that's been promised to you, you're not going to settle for the here and now. See, if you have faith that Bill Gates gave you $1 million in the bank, you will not settle for a life of $20 right now. True faith doesn't say, I guess this is it. The author is writing to the Hebrews, to the Jewish people. They held in such high esteem the angels and Abraham and the priests and the law and the temple. Those things had to be protected against all costs. But the author's cry to these people is that there is so much more, that these things point to a greater reality. That we should not be living our lives for these things, but to rather see how these things point to the greater treasure, the ultimate promise and treasure that God has made. See, all of these things point beyond themselves. From chapter 1 up until this point in the book of Hebrews, the author shows why all of these things held in such high esteem were not the promise, but only a shadow of it. In fact, all of the heroes of the Old Testament, the people that the Jews revered so much, he says that they understood this. In this chapter, chapter 11, the author says that all of these people were looking beyond themselves, beyond the here and now. And they did that because they had faith in a God who promised to do so much more than just this. They understood the promises of God and took God at his word because they knew him. They had faith in a God who could raise the dead, who would install a perfect Jerusalem in a perfect world with a perfect high priest who is seated at the right hand of God. They were heroes not by what they did, but by who and what they had faith in. And the author makes a bold and audacious claim that to these Jewish people. He claims that all of these Old Testament heroes are saved by their faith in Jesus Christ. Think about that. Even though they lived before Jesus was born, they had faith in God and in his promise that was ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Although they had an imperfect picture of what that would look like, we now, living on this side of the cross, see this picture clearly. We get to see the image of Jesus, the full revelation of God's plan that was made from the beginning. And those people in the Old Testament had faith in Christ, even though it was in many ways a blurry image that gained clarity as time progressed. Hebrews 11:24-26 says that Moses considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. But this was hundreds of years before Christ was born. But he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. See, Moses and others had faith in God's ultimate coming promise. And in so doing, they had faith in Christ. Looking ahead really quickly, Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 2, says that Jesus is the founder and the perfecter of our faith. Here's what this means. It means that we have ultimate assurance that what God says is true. Romans 8:32 says this, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things?" Jesus' resurrection shows us that resurrection is in store for us. It shows us that the good things God promises are still to come. That if God was willing to even sacrifice his own son, we can be sure that he will also give us the inheritance that he's promised because he's given us his son. Jesus is the founder and perfecter of our faith. Here's the truth. We all have faith in something. But where does the assurance of your faith come from? I don't know about you, but I will put my faith in the one who sacrificed it all for me. You are guaranteed an inheritance by the God of the universe. You have money in the bank. So stop caring so much about the possessions and the status that you have right now. Don't settle for a life of $2, but live for the inheritance. Live as someone who has and will inherit God's ultimate blessings. The things now that won't last. You can't take them with you. So we have to live to please God because of what he has done for us. So, guys, I hope that this lesson has been helpful to you. As you continue to discuss this with your groups, ponder this gift, this promise, this treasure that God has given, that's ours through Jesus Christ. Have a great night, and I will see you next week.